Okay, so get this. Today, we're tackling something
Mm,
really, uh, really interesting, the Confederate battle flag.
right.
You've sent over some really fascinating stuff, and I'm
Yeah.
ready to unpack it all.
Yeah.
We're doing a deep dive into the history and symbolism of this flag, going beyond what we
Yeah.
see on the surface,
Okay.
and really getting into those deeper layers of meaning.
Absolutely. It's a symbol with way more to it than you might think at first glance, tied up with all these different things, identity, history, people even, like searching for something bigger than themselves.
And I love a good deep dive, so just to be clear, like, we're not here to tell you what to think, okay?
Right.
We're going to look at the different ways people see this flag and why it still gets such strong reactions, even now.
Yeah, for sure.
And to get us started, we're going to be looking at this article you sent over in defense of the Southern Cross. And this author, let me tell you, they don't hold back. They come right out and say the Confederate battle flag, it's about resilience.
Mm.
It's about defending a way of life, even when you've lost.
It's a perspective we don't often hear, especially not in the mainstream. What I find fascinating is how this article, it makes us think about the flag differently. Like there's more to it than just the usual associations, you know?
Exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, there's another side to this story. And then they bring up something that honestly made me stop and think. They talk about how you used to see this flag in black communities,
Right.
even used by politicians like Clinton and Gore back in the day.
Yeah, yeah.
That doesn't really fit with what we usually hear, does it?
It's a perfect example of how a symbol's meaning, it's not set in stone. It can change over time, even within different groups of people. Think of it like social currency. Like its value changes depending on who's holding it and what's happening around them at that time.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Right,
But how does that work with something like the Confederate flag,
right.
especially when we're talking about black communities?
Well, that's where understanding the history is so important. See, for some black communities, especially in the South, the Confederate flag, it might have been more about a shared Southern identity, like a connection to a place and a culture,
Hmm.
not necessarily about supporting slavery or segregation. You got to remember, their ancestors, they built the South too. Alongside those who were considered white, they were there from the very beginning, so it's part of their legacy as well. However, as the fight for civil rights gained momentum, the flag, it became more and more associated with, well, opposition to equality.
So it's not as simple as saying everyone always saw it the same way.
Exactly. Imagine you're in an antique shop, right?
Yeah.
And you find this beautiful piece of jewelry. Now, to you, it's a cool find, something interesting. But someone else might see it and be reminded of, like, a loved one they've lost. Same object, totally different meanings. And the Confederate flag is kind of like,
Wow, that's a powerful way to look at it. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The author of this article, the one defending the flag, they're Canadian. And get this, they even talk about seeing the Confederate flag in Canadian culture.
really? Now that's a twist. Tell me more about that.
So they talk about their dad and how his high school football team in Canada was called the Rebels. They used Confederate symbols, even the flag. And the author claims to have seen it around different provinces over the years.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's like what we were just saying about symbols being adopted and reinterpreted. Sometimes people miss the original meaning or even the history behind it.
Right. It's like you borrow a shirt from a friend, but you don't realize it's got this stain on it from a crazy night out.
Exactly. Except in this case, the stain is a bit more than just a spilled drink, right? And we see it happen all the time with different symbols and historical figures. People are drawn to the way it looks or like a simple version of the story. They miss the deeper, more complex reality.
And there's definitely that romanticization when it comes to the Confederacy. Like, how many movies and shows make it seem glamorous? They focus on gallantry and lost causes, but kind of gloss over the whole slavery and oppression thing?
Yeah, it's easy to romanticize things when you're looking at them from a distance. It's like when you're a kid and you look at old pictures of your parents from the 80s, all that big hair and shoulder pads, it looks cool and fun. But what you don't see are the tough times, the struggles, the full picture.
Right.
And the author of this article touches on something kind of similar when they talk about shared values.
Okay, so what do they mean by shared values in this context?
They're suggesting that some Canadians, especially those who consider themselves more traditional, see parallels between their frustrations and those of the Confederacy. It's this feeling of being unhappy with the system.
Unhappy with the system.
Hmm.
That's interesting. Can you expand on that a bit? Like, what system are we even talking about here? I'm curious how the author connects that to the flag itself.
That's a great question. And it actually leads us right into the core of the article's argument. The author is suggesting this dissatisfaction, it comes from feeling alienated from what they call the liberal world order.
Okay, hold on. It sounds like we're about to really get into it.
We are.
Let's dive into all of that right after we take a quick break.
Yeah, so unhappy with the system, it's pretty broad, you know?
Yeah.
Think of it like this, okay? Like, imagine there are all these people and they feel like nobody's listening to them. Like the rules, they don't work anymore.
Right, right.
That's the kind of feeling the author's getting at here. And they're saying it's a feeling that some people who connect with the Confederate flag today,
Okay.
even those way up in Canada, they feel it too.
So they're looking for something to represent that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
feeling. And for some people, it's this flag, even with all the, all the baggage that comes with it.
Exactly. It's a way of saying, hey, we see you, we hear you, we're pushing back against all of this. And that idea of pushing back, that's really important here. They see this flag, the Confederate flag, as a symbol of resistance, right? Against, they call it the liberal world order.
Liberal world order.
Yeah, basically they're talking about values and systems that they think are like dominant now in the world, things like globalization, certain social progressivism,
Right.
and government intervention in the economy.
Got it. Got it. So they see the flag as like directly against those values.
That's what they're saying, yeah. They're making this connection between how the Confederacy fought the Union
Right.
and what they see as like a modern day version of that struggle
Hmm.
against this liberal world order, as they
Hmm.
call it. The author even uses the term cultural secession, which I thought was really interesting.
Cultural secession. What does that even mean?
It's like they're saying, okay, if we can't change the whole system, the whole thing, we'll just make our own space with
Right.
our own rules.
It's like building a wall, but not a real one.
Right, right.
Like a wall of ideas of identity.
Yeah, exactly. And then they point to how fiercely the Confederacy resisted, even when they were losing, as proof of how much people will fight for what they believe in, for their way of life.
It's so interesting how a symbol can be like a rallying cry for some people.
Yeah.
But then for others, it's like this point of conflict.
Absolutely.
It's like a cultural Rorschach test,
Right.
What you see in it says more about you than it does about the actual symbol, maybe.
That's a great way to put it. It really shows how subjective symbols are,
Yeah.
how our interpretations, they're shaped by our experiences, our background, even our politics.
Right, right. Which brings us back to the main argument here. The author is saying that for them, this flag represents the fight against this liberal world order that they see as being forced on them.
Right, right.
They even go as far as to say that it represents, quote, alternative ways of life that are under threat.
And that's where things get really interesting. See, when a symbol is that closely tied to identity and resistance, it can be really hard to separate it from the feelings and the ideas behind it.
Especially when that symbol, it already has so much history,
Of course.
It's not like this is just some random object. They're talking about a flag that flew over battlefields,
Right.
that represented a government built on slavery.
Absolutely. And that's why we have to be so careful and nuanced when talking about this topic. The author, they're trying to get us to understand why some people might be drawn to the symbol,
Okay.
even if the symbol itself is, really problematic. They're not necessarily saying they agree with what the Confederacy did,
Right.
but they are trying to see things from the perspective of people who see it as a symbol of defiance.
Against a system they feel is against them, right?
Exactly.
It's like what we were talking about before with the flag showing up in Black communities.
Right, right.
The meaning isn't fixed. It's fluid, it depends on the context, and it's really personal.
You got it.
Yeah.
And it's understanding that fluidity, that like there are all these different meanings. That's so important when we talk about something like the Confederate flag.
Absolutely. So we've gone from Canadian football to cultural secession. I have to say, this deep dive has taken us to some unexpected places.
I know, right?
But there's one more thing I want to go back to. The author said something else that really stuck with me. They said that the Confederacy's resistance, the fact that they were willing to fight, that holds important lessons for us today about the limits of power and the dangers of forcing an ideology on people.
That's a really powerful statement, and it gets right to the heart of why this topic is still so fascinating and so debated, even after all these years.
It feels like we've hit another layer of the cake here with this deep dive, and I am ready to dig in. So before the break, we were talking about how the Confederacy's resistance, their decision to fight, could actually have lessons for us now, even today.
Right.
It's like, what can we learn from this? even if we don't agree with what they did. And the author seems to be saying that their struggle, even though it was flawed, can teach us about what happens when you push a single ideology too far. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's complicated, right? But it comes down to this idea that even in a democracy, a government can't have total control over people's lives,
Well,
over their beliefs, their identities, all of that.
so they're saying there's a connection between how the Confederacy fought against the Union
Right.
and what they see as like this modern trend of silencing anyone who disagrees or trying to force one specific worldview on everyone.
Exactly. And they're saying that because the Confederacy was willing to fight so hard, even to the point of war, it shows how much people resist when they feel like everything they value is under attack.
Yeah.
Now, we have to acknowledge that what the Confederacy stood for was wrong, obviously.
Right.
It was rooted in slavery and racism, and that's just, there's no defending that. But the point the author's making isn't about saying what they did was okay. It's more about trying to understand the intensity of their beliefs
Right.
and what drove them to such extremes,
It's like if you keep pushing someone into a corner, at some point they're going to fight back. Right?
Yeah.
Even if their reasons for feeling that way are like based on a messed up view of things.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole topic so difficult, so relevant even now. We can say that what the Confederacy did was wrong, but we can still learn from looking at what led them to resist in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, what were the social, economic, even political things happening back then that created such a huge divide between people?
Right.
How did their leaders use those feelings, those emotions, to turn them into a force that could actually fight a war against their own country?
Yeah, it really is like a puzzle. Trying to put all those pieces together, even if we don't agree with the final picture. But this article, it goes even further than that. The author actually calls Confederate soldiers heroes to be celebrated and emulated. And I gotta say, regardless of how you feel about the flag, it's a lot to say.
It definitely is. It's probably the most controversial thing in the whole article, and we got to be careful with how we approach it. The author is presenting this idea of resistance against tyranny,
Okay.
even though the cause itself was, as we said, morally wrong.
So they're focusing on this idea of the Confederacy fighting for their own autonomy
Nice.
and how they stood up to what they saw as aggression from the North.
Right.
But they're not really addressing the fact that they were fighting to keep a horrible system in place.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really, really complicated. Because history is messy, right? It's not always clear-cut, good versus bad. It's full of these gray areas of people who were both brave and also part of terrible things. The challenge is to look at that complexity honestly, to see the good and the bad without simplifying things or turning anyone into a hero when they don't deserve it.
Right. It's like you said earlier. We got to understand the context, the motivations, the whole picture,
Yeah.
even when it's not pretty.
You got it. And that takes empathy. It takes critical thinking. It takes being willing to sit with things that make us uncomfortable. At the end of the day, it's up to each person to decide how they see the symbol and the history that comes with it.
That's a great point. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the symbolism of the Confederate battle flag to all these historical narratives and even like the ethics of commemoration. It's been quite the journey.
It has.
But you know what they say? The best conversations usually are.
So, to everyone listening, we want to hear from you. How do you see the Confederate flag today? What makes someone from history worthy of admiration, especially when they were part of something so complex and morally wrong? Keep those questions in mind, everyone, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.